Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. It hangs limp during the day, unmoving even when the windows are open. But when I pass by and look away, it shifts, just slightly, like it's adjusting. One evening, I placed a chair in front of it and waited. Hours passed in silence. Nothing moved, but the next morning, the chair had turned toward the curtain. I don't remember doing that. Now, whenever I enter the room, the air feels warmer behind the fabric, as if something just exhaled. I've stopped looking directly at it, but I feel it watching from the folds. The fabric is burgundy velvet, thick and heavy. I chose it because it blocked out the harsh morning light completely. The previous tenant had left behind thin, gauzy curtains that barely covered the window frame. This new one felt substantial, permanent. I hung it myself on a cold afternoon, wrestling with the heavy rod until it sat perfectly level. The weight of it satisfied me. It looked expensive, dignified even. For weeks, it behaved as curtains should. It hung motionless against the wall, gathering dust in its deep creases. I would draw it open each morning and close it each evening, a ritual as automatic as breathing. The fabric felt cool against my palm when I grasped it, smooth and reassuring. But something began to change in the way it responded to my touch. The texture seemed to shift beneath my fingers, becoming warmer, almost yielding. I first noticed the movement on a Tuesday. I had been reading in the armchair beside the window when I caught something in my peripheral vision. A gentle sway, as if disturbed by a breeze. But the window was closed, had been closed all day. I looked directly at the curtain. It hung perfectly still, its surface unbroken by even the slightest wrinkle. I returned to my book, but my concentration had scattered. The words blurred together on the page. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling. Wood creaking, pipes ticking, the refrigerator humming its mechanical lullaby. But underneath these familiar noises, I heard something else. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against itself. It came from the direction of the living room where the curtain hung. I told myself it was nothing, just the house breathing in its sleep. The next morning, I found the reading lamp beside the window had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted a few inches closer to the curtain. The cord stretched taut between the lamp and the wall outlet, creating a small arc of tension I hadn't noticed before. I must have knocked it while cleaning, though I couldn't remember doing so. I adjusted it back to its original position, but the wrongness of it lingered in my mind like a splinter. I began to pay attention to the curtain in ways I never had before. I would glance at it when I thought it wasn't expecting my gaze, trying to catch it in motion. But it remained stubbornly still whenever I looked directly at it. Only in those moments when my attention wandered elsewhere did I sense its subtle animation. A flutter here, a gentle fold there, as if it were breathing in rhythm with something I couldn't see. The smell started a week later. A faint sweetness that reminded me of wilting flowers, but not quite. It clung to the fabric when I got close enough to examine it. I pressed my nose to the velvet, inhaling deeply. The scent was stronger there, almost cloying. Underneath the sweetness lay something else, something organic and warm, like skin that had been in the sun too long. I decided to wash the curtain. Perhaps it had absorbed odors from the previous apartment, or maybe the fabric treatment was breaking down. I took it down carefully, folding it into manageable sections. Without it, the window looked naked, exposed. Light poured in unfiltered, harsh, and unforgiving. I hung a sheet in its place temporarily, but the room felt incomplete, vulnerable. The dry cleaner looked at me strangely when I brought in the curtain. He held it up to the light, running his fingers along the fabric's surface. "This is unusual," he said, his accent thick with something I couldn't place. "Very old technique, very expensive." He quoted me a price that made me wince, but I agreed. I needed the curtain back, clean and normal. 3 days later, I retrieved it. The dry cleaner seemed reluctant to hand it over. "It fought the cleaning," he said, wrapping it carefully in plastic. "The fabric, it holds on to things. Very stubborn." I thanked him and left quickly, his words echoing in my mind. Fabric doesn't fight anything. It's just thread and dye and weave. I rehung the curtain that evening, grateful to have it back in its proper place. The room felt complete again, protected. But as I smoothed the fabric against the wall, I noticed something wrong. The pattern had changed. The velvet's pile now caught light differently, creating shadows that hadn't been there before. In certain angles, the shadows almost looked like shapes, like profiles of faces I didn't recognize. That night, I dreamed of the curtain. In the dream, it was transparent, and I could see through it to the other side. But instead of the familiar view of the courtyard, there was another room, identical to mine, but somehow wrong. The furniture was the same, but arranged differently. The colors were muted, as if seen through water. And in the center of that other room stood a figure, watching me through the glass. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth. The room was darker than usual, the morning light struggling to penetrate the curtain's thickness. I stumbled to the window and pulled the fabric aside. The courtyard looked normal, reassuringly mundane. But when I let the curtain fall back into place, I noticed my handprint remained on the fabric, a warm impression that glowed faintly in the dim light. I started keeping a journal, documenting the curtain's behavior. Each entry detailed the small changes I observed, the subtle shifts in its position, the way it seemed to react to my presence. I recorded temperatures, noting how the area around the window was consistently warmer when the curtain was closed. I measured the fabric's dimensions, checking for any physical changes. Everything appeared normal on paper, but the feeling of wrongness persisted. The recordings began accidentally. I had been dictating notes into my phone when I noticed something in the playback. Between my words, barely audible, there was another voice. A whisper, so faint I had to strain to hear it. It spoke in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that seemed to twist around themselves. I played the recording again and again, but the whisper grew fainter with each repetition, as if it were retreating deeper into the digital noise. I started leaving the phone recording overnight, positioned near the curtain. Each morning, I would review hours of seemingly empty audio. But occasionally, there would be something. A rustle of fabric, a soft sigh, words in that same unknown language. I began to recognize patterns in the whispers, repeated phrases that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond my comprehension. The curtain's behavior became more pronounced. I would find it bunched in impossible ways, as if hands had gathered it from behind. Sometimes it would be perfectly smooth, stretched taut against the wall, with no wrinkles or folds. Other times, it would hang in elaborate drapes, arranged in configurations I couldn't have created myself. Each morning brought a new arrangement, a new message I couldn't decode. I stopped opening the curtain during the day. The room lived in perpetual twilight, lit only by lamps that seemed to burn dimmer than they should. The warm spot behind the fabric grew more pronounced, radiating heat that I could feel from across the room. Sometimes, late at night, I would see the curtain's surface ripple, as if something were moving behind it, pressing against the fabric from the other side. The mirror in the hallway began to show me things that weren't there. reflections of the curtain room that didn't match reality. In the glass, the curtain would be open when I knew it was closed, or it would hang in colors that shifted from burgundy to deep purple to black. I avoided looking at the mirror directly, but I could feel its presence pulling at my peripheral vision. I invited a friend over, desperate for someone else to witness what I was experiencing. But in their presence, the curtain behaved perfectly. It hung motionless and unremarkable, just fabric doing what fabric does. My friend admired its rich color and heavy texture, running their hand along its surface without noticing the warmth or the way it seemed to lean into their touch. After they left, I felt more isolated than before. The whispers in my recordings grew clearer, more insistent. I began to make out individual words, though their meaning remained elusive. They spoke of watching, of waiting, of something that had been patient for a very long time. The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, something that had forgotten what it meant to be human. I tried to research the curtain's history, but the previous tenant had left no forwarding address. The building's superintendent claimed no knowledge of the original fabric, insisting that all window treatments had been removed between tenants. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in the way he avoided looking at the curtain when he came to fix the heating, the way he hurried through his work and left without his usual small talk. The temperature behind the curtain continued to rise. I could feel the heat radiating through the fabric, warming my face when I stood close. I pressed my palm against the velvet and felt something press back, a gentle but insistent pressure that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. The fabric pulsed with life, with intention, with something that recognized my touch and responded to it. Sleep became impossible. The curtain's presence filled my dreams, its weight pressing down on me like a physical force. I would wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of that unknown language thick on my tongue. The whispers had moved from the recordings into my head, speaking directly to me in moments between waking and sleeping. I decided to document everything one final time. I set up cameras, positioned microphones, arranged lights to capture every angle of the curtain's behavior. But as I began recording, the equipment malfunctioned. Cameras showed static. Microphones picked up only white noise. Lights flickered and died. The curtain remained perfectly still throughout, as if mocking my attempts to prove its strangeness. In frustration, I grabbed the fabric with both hands, pulling it aside violently. The window behind it was gone. In its place stretched an endless darkness, deeper than night, deeper than the space between stars. The darkness breathed, expanding and contracting like living tissue. And from its depths, something looked back at me with eyes that reflected my own terror. I stumbled backward, releasing the curtain. It fell back into place with a soft whisper, sealing the darkness behind its burgundy surface. But the damage was done. I had seen what lay beyond the fabric, and it had seen me. The recognition in those eyes, the hunger, the patient malevolence that had been waiting for this moment. Now I sit in my chair, writing these words, while the curtain watches from across the room. The warmth behind it has spread throughout the apartment, turning the air thick and humid. The whispers have stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence. The kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens. I can feel movement behind the fabric, not the gentle swaying I had grown accustomed to, but something more deliberate. Something that has decided to stop hiding. The curtain bulges outward, as if pushed by invisible hands, then settles back into place. But each time it moves, it hangs differently, arranged in new patterns that hurt to look at directly. The mirror in the hallway has gone dark, reflecting nothing but shadow. The recordings on my phone have been erased, leaving only empty files that play back in perfect silence. All evidence of my experience has been consumed, leaving only my memory and these words as proof that something happened here. I think about leaving, packing my things, and finding somewhere else to live. But I know it won't matter. The curtain has seen me, recognized me, chosen me for whatever purpose it serves. Distance won't break the connection we forged. It will follow me wherever I go, hanging in windows that shouldn't exist, breathing in rhythm with my own lungs. The apartment grows warmer. The air tastes of copper and wilting flowers. And behind the curtain, something patient and ancient prepares to step through from its world into mine. I close my eyes and wait for the soft rustle of fabric, the whisper of feet on hardwood, the moment when the boundary between watcher and watched finally dissolves. When I open my eyes again, the curtain hangs differently, and I understand with crystalline clarity that I am no longer alone in this room. I have never been alone in this room. The curtain breathes when I turn my back, and now I know why. It's not the fabric that breathes. It's what lives behind it, what has always lived behind it, what will continue to live behind it long after I'm gone. The warmth surrounds me now, familiar and comforting. The whispers return, but they're clearer now, almost welcoming. I understand the words at last. They're not in a foreign language after all. They're in my own voice, calling to me from the other side of the curtain, telling me it's time to come home. Story 2. They're just part of the floor, cold and uniform, or they were, until I noticed the cracks between them forming shapes, symbols I never learned but somehow recognize. The patterns tighten around the door, curve toward the windows. I tried stepping over them. My feet burned. I moved furniture to cover the path. The furniture moved back overnight. Now the tiles shift without sound, just enough to guide my steps. I'm still inside. I think that's the point. I think the floor is closing its trap. The kitchen tiles were white ceramic, practical, and clean. I'd swept them every morning for months, felt their smooth surface beneath my bare feet during countless midnight water runs. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. Until the morning, I found myself staring at the grout lines, seeing something that made my breath catch. The spaces between the tiles weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with meaning, just beyond my understanding. I knelt, tracing the lines with my finger. The grout felt warmer than it should, almost body temperature. The patterns radiated outward from the center of the room, growing more complex as they approached the walls. I stood dizzy, telling myself it was exhaustion, work stress, too much coffee. But when I looked down again, the patterns were still there, undeniable and purposeful. They created pathways across the floor, channels that seemed to flow toward specific destinations. The thickest line led directly to the refrigerator. Another curved toward the sink. A third, more elaborate pattern wound its way to the doorway leading to the living room. I followed that third path, my feet naturally falling into the spaces between the tiles. The sensation was oddly comforting, like walking on a predetermined route. But when I reached the doorway, something made me stop. The pattern continued into the living room, but it changed. The lines became tighter, more restrictive. They formed a narrow corridor that led straight to the couch, then back to the kitchen. A loop. Over the following days, I found myself studying the floor obsessively. I took photographs from different angles, but the patterns looked different in each shot. Sometimes they appeared as simple grout lines. Other times, they resembled ancient script, symbols that triggered a recognition I couldn't explain. I began keeping a notebook, sketching the configurations as they appeared to me. The patterns weren't static. They shifted subtly, like a living thing breathing. The path to the front door became increasingly narrow, the tiles on either side seeming to press inward. When I placed my foot outside the designated walkway, a sharp burning sensation shot up my leg. Not painful exactly, but wrong. Fundamentally wrong. I decided to test the boundaries. I rearranged the furniture, placing the coffee table directly across the main pathway. The table was heavy, solid wood that required considerable effort to move. I positioned it carefully, creating a barrier that would force me to step outside the tile pattern. The next morning, the table had returned to its original position. I hadn't moved it. I lived alone. The doors were locked, the windows secure. But the table sat exactly where it had been before, as if my intervention had never occurred. I installed a camera, one of those small devices meant for home security. I positioned it to monitor the living room, then went to bed. The footage showed nothing unusual, just an empty room, furniture in place, shadows moving naturally as the moon shifted across the sky. But when I compared the first frame to the last, the table had moved. Not dramatically, just enough to clear the pathway. The camera had recorded 8 hours of footage, but somehow missed the moment of movement. The burning in my feet intensified when I tried to deviate from the patterns. I purchased thick-soled shoes, but the sensation penetrated through. I laid down rugs, but they wrinkled and shifted, never quite covering the pathways. The house seemed to resist my attempts at modification. I began to notice other changes. The patterns grew more elaborate, developing side branches that led to specific objects. A curved line guided me to the lamp switch. Another pattern drew me to the bookshelf. The configurations became more insistent, more demanding. When I ignored them, the burning sensation spread beyond my feet. My legs ached. My head throbbed. The walls themselves seemed to participate in the conspiracy. I noticed faint discolorations, marks that aligned with the floor patterns. When I traced these marks with my finger, they felt warm and slightly raised, as if the wall was breathing beneath the paint. The marks led to electrical outlets, light switches, the thermostat. They formed a network that every functional element of the house. I tried to leave. The front door opened normally, but as I stepped across the threshold, the burning sensation became unbearable. Not just in my feet, but throughout my entire body. My vision blurred. My hands shook. I stumbled backward, and the pain immediately subsided. The house welcomed me back with a subtle shift in the patterns, the lines seeming to pulse with satisfaction. I called a friend, tried to explain what was happening. My voice sounded strange, disconnected. The words came out wrong, disjointed. I heard myself describing normal household maintenance, routine cleaning, nothing unusual. But that wasn't what I meant to say. I hung up, disturbed by my own inability to communicate the truth. The notebook where I'd been sketching the patterns had changed. The pages now showed different drawings, more complex symbols that I didn't remember creating. My handwriting, but not my thoughts. The sketches moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Subtle shifts that created the impression of animation. I found myself following the patterns automatically, without conscious decision. My feet knew the routes. My body moved through the predetermined paths with increasing fluency. Fighting the guidance became exhausting. Accepting it felt natural, almost peaceful. The house grew smaller, not physically, but in terms of accessible space. The patterns constrained my movement to increasingly narrow corridors. Areas that had been open became forbidden. The bedroom required a specific spiral approach. The bathroom could only be reached through a series of precise steps that felt like a ritual. I documented everything, but the documentation kept changing. Photos showed different scenes than what I remembered capturing. Videos played back with subtle alterations. My computer files rearranged themselves, creating new folders with names I didn't recognize, filled with images of symbols that hurt to look at directly. The final restriction came gradually. The patterns converged, creating a single pathway that formed a tight loop between the kitchen and living room. I could no longer reach the bedroom. The bathroom became inaccessible. The loop grew smaller each day, the tiles shifting imperceptibly inward. I understand now that I've been prepared for this moment. The house has been teaching me, training me to accept confinement. The patterns weren't random. They were a curriculum, a gradual conditioning process that made each restriction feel natural, inevitable. I sit in the center of the loop, the tiles warm beneath me. The patterns pulse with gentle light, beautiful and hypnotic. I no longer fight the guidance. I no longer want to leave. The house has become my body, the patterns my circulatory system. I am home, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between the tiles breathing, I remember the person I was before. I remember wanting to go outside, to feel rain, to walk on earth that didn't burn my feet. That person feels distant now, like a character from a story I once read. The patterns continue to shift, and I realize they're not finished with me yet. There are deeper configurations waiting, more complex arrangements that will require my complete surrender. I can see them forming at the edges of my vision, patient and inevitable. The tiles are arranged to keep me inside. I'm beginning to understand that inside and outside are relative terms. The house isn't containing me. It's protecting me. From what? I'm not certain. But I trust the patterns. They've never led me astray. The loop is closing now. Soon, I won't need to move at all. The patterns will be complete, and I'll be exactly where I'm supposed to be, where I've always been supposed to be. The tiles know best. They've been arranging themselves for this moment since the beginning. I close my eyes and let the warmth guide me to the final configuration. Story 3. The hallway is short, the layout simple. But lately, I walk through a door and find myself in the same room I just left. Not similar, identical. Same creases in the blanket. Same drops in the sink. I mark things before I leave, a pencil on the table, a book turned upside down, and find them repeated in the next space. Not moved, duplicated. I've tried leaving the house, but each door opens into a version of where I was. I don't think I'm looping. I think the house is replicating, and it's starting to forget which one of me came first. The first sign was the coffee cup. I'd left it on the kitchen counter, half empty, lipstick stain on the rim. The ceramic was still warm when I returned from the bathroom, but the liquid inside had that peculiar coolness that comes from sitting too long. I touched the handle and felt a slight tremor, like the cup was vibrating at a frequency just below perception. The coffee tasted different, not bitter or sweet, just displaced, as if it belonged to someone else's morning routine. I started paying attention to details after that. The way dust motes moved in the afternoon light streaming through the living room window. They didn't follow air currents anymore. They moved in perfect geometric patterns, spiraling in ways defied physics. When I exhaled, they scattered normally for a moment, then reformed into those same impossible configurations. I found myself holding my breath, watching them dance their unnatural choreography. The walls began to feel different under my fingertips, not visibly changed, but when I pressed my palm against them, they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. Sometimes the surface felt warm, sometimes cold, shifting between temperatures without warning. The paint remained the same pale blue I'd chosen, but in certain light, it appeared to shimmer like water disturbed by an invisible stone. I decided to document everything. I started with photographs, capturing the same corner of the bedroom from different angles. In the first image, the bedside lamp cast a normal shadow. In the second, taken moments later, the shadow bent at an impossible angle, reaching toward the window despite the light source remaining stationary. I checked the camera settings, cleaned the lens, took another shot. The shadow had returned to normal, but now there was a reflection in the mirror that showed the room from a perspective I couldn't have taken from my position. My notebook became filled with observations. The refrigerator hummed in a different key each day, cycling through what sounded like fragments of a melody I couldn't quite remember. The bathroom faucet left water drops that formed perfect circles on the counter, never irregular splotches like water should make. When I wiped them away, they left faint marks that resembled letters in a language I didn't recognize. The duplications started small. I'd place a book on the coffee table and find another copy underneath it. Pages identical, but the paper feeling somehow newer, as if it had been printed moments before. I tested this by writing my name on the first page of a magazine. The duplicate appeared with my handwriting, but the pen strokes were slightly bolder, more confident than I remembered making them. Sleep became difficult, not because of nightmares, but because of the sounds. Whispers coming from the electrical outlets, so faint I had to press my ear against them to hear anything at all. The voices spoke in overlapping conversations, discussing things I'd done that day, but from perspectives that weren't mine. One voice described watching me make breakfast while standing in the pantry. Another mentioned observing me from inside the television screen. I began leaving deliberate markers before entering each room. A coin balanced on its edge, a glass positioned at a specific angle, a piece of paper folded into a particular shape. Each time, I'd find the marker exactly as I'd left it, plus an identical one in a location that made no sense. The coin would be balanced on the edge of the table, and also somehow balanced on the edge of nothing, suspended in midair for just a moment before falling. The mirrors started showing inconsistencies, not dramatic changes, but subtle wrongness that made my reflection feel like a stranger wearing my face. My reflection would blink a fraction of a second after I did, or turn its head slightly before I moved mine. Sometimes it would be performing actions I wasn't doing, reaching for something, opening its mouth to speak, writing in a notebook I couldn't see. I tried to leave the house, but the front door opened onto my kitchen. The back door revealed the living room. Every exit led to a room I'd already been in, but never quite the same version. The kitchen might have the same layout, but the refrigerator would hum that different melody, or the coffee cup would be in a position I didn't remember leaving it. The living room would contain the same furniture, but the dust motes would be frozen in mid-dance, waiting for me to breathe again. The duplications grew more personal. I found another version of my journal, written in my handwriting, but describing experiences I hadn't had. It mentioned conversations with people I'd never met, meals I'd never eaten, dreams I'd never dreamed. The entries were dated with days that didn't exist, or existed twice, or described events that seemed to happen simultaneously in different rooms. My clothes appeared in the laundry basket clean and folded while I was still wearing them. I'd find my toothbrush in the bathroom holder while holding an identical one in my hand. The shower would be wet from a shower I hadn't taken, towels damp from a body that wasn't mine, but somehow was. The house began to feel larger from the inside than it appeared from the outside, though I could no longer go outside to confirm this. Rooms I'd mapped carefully seemed to stretch when I wasn't looking directly at them. The hallway that connected everything grew longer each day, requiring more steps to traverse, though the walls remained the same distance apart. I started finding evidence of other versions of myself. Not dramatic proof, just small things that suggested someone with my habits and preferences had been living parallel routines. Coffee prepared with the exact amount of sugar I used, but in a cup I'd never owned. Books bookmarked on pages I'd been meaning to read, but hadn't reached yet. A grocery list written in my handwriting, listing items I'd been considering buying, but hadn't written down. The whispers in the walls became clearer. They weren't discussing my actions anymore. They were discussing my thoughts. Conversations about decisions I was contemplating. Reactions to events that hadn't happened yet. Opinions about things I'd never considered. It was as if the house was thinking alongside me, or ahead of me, processing possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. I realized I was no longer sure which version of each room was the original. The markers I'd left had multiplied so many times that every surface held evidence of my presence. But the accumulation made it impossible to distinguish between authentic and duplicate. My own handwriting had become suspect. Was this note something I'd written, or something the house had learned to write in my style? The temperature began to shift in patterns that followed my movement. Rooms would grow warmer when I entered them, as if they were welcoming me home, then cool rapidly when I prepared to leave, as if trying to encourage me to stay longer. The walls had learned to anticipate my presence, adjusting their warmth before I'd even decided which room to enter next. I'm writing this now in what I believe is my study, though I've found identical notebooks in 4 different rooms, all filled with these same words. The pen feels familiar in my hand, but I've discovered other pens, same brand, same ink level, scattered throughout the house, as if multiple versions of me have been writing simultaneously. The house has stopped pretending to be normal. Doors open before I reach them. Lights turn on in rooms I'm approaching. The coffee maker starts brewing when I wake up, though I never set it the night before. Everything anticipates my needs, but in a way that suggests it knows more about my intentions than I do. I think I understand now. The house isn't duplicating objects or rooms. It's duplicating me. Each time I move through a door, I leave something behind, some aspect of my presence, my decisions, my awareness. The house collects these fragments and uses them to populate the spaces I've vacated. I'm not encountering copies of my belongings. I'm encountering the remnants of previous versions of myself. The mirrors reflect not just my image, but the accumulated images of every time I've looked into them. The whispers in the walls are the echoes of every thought I've had while living here. The house has become a repository of my existence, and I've become just another element in its collection. I can feel myself becoming less distinct each day. My thoughts blend with the whispers. My actions match the patterns the house has learned to expect. I'm starting to forget which choices are mine and and which are simply repetitions of choices I've made before. The house doesn't need to trap me here. It's becoming me, and I'm becoming it. The notebook in my hands feels both familiar and foreign. The words I'm writing seem to be writing themselves, flowing from knowledge I don't remember acquiring. I suspect that when I finish this entry, I'll find it has appeared in all the other rooms, written in all the other notebooks, by all the other versions of myself who have discovered the same truth. The house doesn't repeat rooms I've already left. It repeats me in the rooms I never truly leave behind. Story 4. It's a cold place, sure, but when I breathe near the kitchen window, the condensation appears outside. I tested it again and again. My breath on the glass, fog forming on the wrong side. I thought maybe it was a draft, a flaw in the seal. But when I pressed my face close, I saw something opposite me. Not a reflection, a figure, not mimicking, just standing still in the fog, watching. When I gasped, the glass fogged from both sides. I haven't gone near the window since, but sometimes I hear tapping in sync with my own heartbeat. The house settled into its rhythm after that discovery. The wooden floors creaked with familiar weight, yet the pattern felt wrong somehow. I started paying attention to sounds I'd previously ignored. The refrigerator hummed a note slightly off-key. The heating system whispered words that weren't quite words. When I stood perfectly still, I could hear my own breathing echoing from somewhere else in the house. I began documenting everything. A notebook filled with observations. The way shadows fell at angles that defied the light sources. How the bathroom mirror showed reflections that lagged behind my movements by just a fraction of a second. The scent of rain penetrated rooms with no open windows, strongest near the walls that should have been warmest. The figure in the condensation became a regular presence. Not every time I breathed on glass, but often enough that I started expecting it. I tried different windows throughout the house. Each time, the same result. My breath created fog on the exterior surface, and within that fog, the outline of someone standing just beyond the glass. Never moving, never reacting to my presence, just observing with what felt like infinite patience. I pressed my palm against the kitchen window one evening, testing its temperature. The glass felt warm where my hand touched it, but ice cold everywhere else. The condensation from my breath still formed outside, even though physics insisted it should appear on the interior surface. I traced letters in the fog with my finger, watching them appear backward on the outer glass. Who are you? The letters materialized reversed, as if someone on the other side was reading them correctly. The tapping grew more frequent, not random percussion, but deliberate communication. 3 soft taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. Always when my heart rate elevated, always maintaining that synchronized rhythm. I tried tapping back, knocking on walls, on tables, on the window itself. The response came immediately, perfectly mirroring my pattern, but always staying 1 beat ahead, as if predicting my next move. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the house breathe around me, feeling the walls expand and contract with each of my own breaths. The heating vents carried whispers that sounded like conversations held in adjacent rooms. But when I investigated, I found only empty spaces and the lingering scent of something floral and out of place. I started leaving recording devices throughout the house. My phone, an old cassette recorder, even a digital voice recorder I'd used for work. Each morning, I'd check them, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomena. The recordings showed nothing during playback, but the files themselves were corrupted, filled with static that formed patterns when I analyzed the waveforms. The patterns looked like breathing, like heartbeats, like the rhythm of someone walking through rooms that should have been empty. The figure in the condensation began to change. Subtle alterations in posture, in the way it held its head, in the space it occupied within the fog. Sometimes it appeared closer to the glass, sometimes farther away. One morning, I breathed on the bathroom mirror and saw it standing directly behind me in the reflection, close enough that I should have felt its presence. When I spun around, the room was empty, but the mirror showed the fog still clinging to its surface, outlining a space where someone had been standing. I tried covering the windows with newspapers, with cardboard, with anything that would block the view. But the condensation still formed, seeping through the barriers, creating that familiar fog pattern on surfaces that should have been dry. The figure appeared even then, visible through the improvised coverings, as if they were transparent. The tapping continued, now accompanied by the sound of fingernails dragging across glass, always just out of sight. The house began to feel smaller, the rooms rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. Doorways led to spaces that felt wrong. Walls that should have been familiar now carried different textures under my fingertips. The floorboards beneath my feet sometimes gave way slightly, as if the foundation itself was shifting to accommodate something moving beneath. I decided to leave, to pack whatever I could carry and find somewhere else to stay. But as I reached for the front door handle, my breath created condensation on the glass panel, and there it was again. The figure standing on the other side of the door, blocking my path. Not threatening, just present, patient, permanent. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tapping sound filled the house now, coming from every surface, every wall, every window. Not chaotic, but coordinated, like a symphony of percussion, perfectly matched to my pulse. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within, from the spaces between my thoughts, from the rhythm of my own existence. The figure is still there, in every reflection, in every breath-fogged surface. I've stopped trying to understand it, stopped trying to document it, stopped trying to escape it. The house breathes with me now, shares my rhythm, mirrors my movements. Sometimes I catch myself tapping along with the sound, my fingers finding the pattern without conscious thought. The condensation appears wherever I am now, following me from room to room, surface to surface. My breath creates fog in places where fog shouldn't exist. And within that fog, the figure watches, waits, and somehow I'm beginning to understand that it's not watching me. It's showing me what I'm becoming. Story 5. The wood creaks like any old home, but it creaks differently when I walk, like it winces, not under pressure, but in protest. I once dropped a glass and stepped to clean it up. The floor snapped upward, splintering beneath my heel. I bled, and when I sat down, the groaning stopped. Silence, almost satisfaction. Since then, I've tried tiptoeing. Nothing helps. Each step is met with resistance, like I'm walking across something that doesn't want to be disturbed. I think the house isn't tired. I think it's hurting. And I think I'm the cause. The first peculiar thing I noticed was the temperature. Cold spots appeared beneath my feet, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The sensation crept through my socks, numbing my toes before retreating just as I lifted my foot. The hardwood felt normal to the touch when I knelt and pressed my palm against it. Warm, inviting. But the moment I stood, the chill returned, focused and deliberate. I began documenting everything. A notebook filled with sketches of the room, measurements of the boards, descriptions of sounds. The creaking followed patterns I couldn't decode, sometimes sharp and brief, like a gasp, other times prolonged and deep, vibrating through the walls. I recorded the sounds on my phone, playing them back through headphones. In the recordings, beneath the obvious groans, I heard something else. A whisper. Not words exactly, but the suggestion of communication. The audio waveform showed spikes that shouldn't exist in simple wood expansion. The smell began subtly. Pine sap, rich and sticky, though the floors were oak. It intensified when I walked faster, as if my movement disturbed something beneath the surface. I searched for the source, running my fingers along the baseboards, checking for hidden leaks or rot. Nothing. The scent seemed to rise from the wood itself, concentrated in the spots where I stepped most frequently. I tried different approaches. Barefoot walking produced the most violent reactions. The floor would buckle slightly, creating tiny ridges that pressed against my soles. With shoes, the protests were muffled but persistent. I experimented with walking only on the edges of the room near the walls, but the phenomenon followed me. The wood remembered my path, cooling and creaking in my wake. Sleep became difficult. From my bed, I could hear the floor settling, but not in the natural way old houses relax. These sounds were responsive, almost conversational. A long groan from the hallway would be answered by a shorter one from the kitchen. The patterns suggested a network of communication I couldn't understand. I lay awake, mapping the sounds, trying to determine if they corresponded to my movements from earlier. The breakthrough came when I noticed the reflection. Light from the window created a golden rectangle on the floor, and within it I saw ripples. Not on the surface, but somehow beneath it, as if the wood existed in layers I couldn't perceive. The ripples moved when I moved, creating disturbances that spread outward before fading. I held my breath and stepped into the light. The ripples became violent, chaotic, like I had disturbed a hidden pool. I stopped walking entirely for one full day. Sat in a chair, ordered food to be left outside, crawled when necessary. The house grew quiet, too quiet. The silence felt expectant, almost hungry. When I finally stood and took a single step, the reaction was explosive. The entire floor seemed to sag, boards separating slightly before snapping back together. The sound echoed through every room, a cry of protest that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The realization hit me gradually. This wasn't random. The floor wasn't just responding to my presence, it was learning. Each step taught it something new about my weight, my rhythm, my intentions. The cold spots appeared faster now, anticipating where I would walk. The creaking preceded my movements, as if the wood was preparing itself for impact. I had become predictable, and that predictability was being used against me. I began walking irregularly, changing directions mid-step, pausing randomly. The floor adapted. The cold spots became more aggressive, spreading faster and staying longer. The creaking grew louder, more insistent. I felt vibrations through my legs, subtle tremors that seemed to originate from deep beneath the house. The whispers in my recordings became clearer, more urgent. Not quite words, but undeniably intentional. The breaking point came when I tried to leave. At the threshold, my foot met resistance I had never experienced. Not physical, I could still move, but something deeper. The wood beneath the doorway felt different, denser, as if it had grown thicker. The cold was so intense it burned. I lifted my foot and found frost crystals clinging to my sole, though the temperature was warm. The whispers became a roar, filling my headphones with static, and something underneath that might have been pleading. I backed away from the door, and the sensations subsided. The floor returned to its normal temperature. The sounds faded to their usual murmur. I was no longer walking on wood. I was walking on something that had learned to fear my departure more than my presence. The house had made its decision about me, and I had made mine about it. Now I sit more than I walk. The floors have grown comfortable with my stillness, almost affectionate. The cold spots have become warm ones, gathering beneath my feet like a cat seeking attention. The creaking has softened to something resembling contentment. But sometimes, when I catch myself walking normally, forgetting to be careful, the protests return. Sharper now, more desperate. I understand now that I am not living in this house. I am living with it. And it has made perfectly clear that some relationships require sacrifice. My mobility for its peace, my freedom for its comfort. The floors no longer hurt when I walk on them. They hurt when I think about walking away. And that pain, I have learned, is contagious. The notebook sits closed on my desk, its pages filled with observations I no longer need to make. The pattern is complete. The house has trained me as thoroughly as I thought I was studying it. My steps have become its steps, my rhythm its rhythm. And in the growing darkness, as I listen to the satisfied murmur of wood settling into familiarity, I wonder if I am the first to learn this lesson, or merely the most recent. The floor doesn't like to be walked on. it has learned to tolerate the walker, and the walker has learned not to walk away. Story 6. I clean obsessively. Always have. But one morning I noticed something strange, a perfect outline in the dust. Like someone had been lying on the hallway floor, curled tightly. I checked the camera. Nothing showed. I cleaned it immediately. But the shape returned 2 days later in a different room under the table. Always undisturbed. Always silent. Like it's pressing itself into the corners of my home without ever entering. And the more I clean, the more often it appears. Almost like it's chasing the places I've touched. Almost like it wants me to notice. The house smells different when I find these marks. Not bad exactly, but wrong. Like copper pennies mixed with old fabric softener. The scent clings to my nostrils long after I've scrubbed the area clean, following me from room to room until I'm not sure if it's real or if my mind is playing tricks. I started documenting everything. Each shape, each location, each subtle change in the air. The outline is always the same size, adult, but smaller than me. The edges are too precise, too deliberate. Dust doesn't settle like that naturally. It drifts, accumulates randomly, but these marks are intentional, purposeful. My cleaning routine became more frequent. Where I once vacuumed twice a week, I now sweep and mop daily. The ritual calms me, gives me control, but the shapes multiply. They appear in places I cleaned just hours before. Behind the couch, beneath the kitchen sink, in the narrow space between the refrigerator and the wall where no one should fit. I installed additional cameras, motion sensors. Nothing captures the moment of formation. The shapes simply exist as if they've always been there, waiting for me to discover them. I review the footage obsessively, frame by frame, searching for the exact moment when empty floor becomes occupied by this impossible impression. The dust feels different when I touch it, warmer than it should be. When I run my fingers along the edges, the particles stick to my skin like they're magnetized. I've started wearing gloves, but even through rubber, I can feel the strange texture. It's not quite right, too fine, too uniform, like it's been sifted through something impossibly delicate. Sleep becomes difficult, not because of fear, but because of anticipation. I lie awake listening to the house settle, waiting for the soft whisper of dust rearranging itself into familiar patterns. Sometimes I think I hear breathing that isn't mine, shallow and careful, as if something is trying very hard not to be noticed. I began leaving small objects near the shapes. A coin here, a pen there, markers to see if whatever creates these impressions interacts with the physical world. The objects remain untouched, but they grow warm. Not hot enough to be alarming, just enough to make me question my senses. When I pick them up, they feel heavier than they should. The shapes started appearing in multiples. 2 outlines in the living room, positioned as if in conversation. 3 in the bedroom, arranged like a family. They overlap sometimes, creating dense patches where the dust forms impossible layers. My vacuum struggles with these areas, the motor whining as if it's trying to lift something much heavier than household debris. I stopped inviting people over. How could I explain the compulsive cleaning, the cameras, the careful way I navigate around certain spots on the floor? How could I describe the growing certainty that my home is being inhabited by something that leaves only the faintest evidence of its presence? The breakthrough came when I noticed my own footprints, not in the dust, but in the absence of it. Every place I stepped left a clean impression, and I realized I was creating a record of my own movement. But these other shapes, they weren't removing dust. They were concentrating it, pulling it from the air and surrounding surfaces to create their perfect silhouettes. I tried sleeping in different rooms, thinking proximity might be the factor. But the shapes followed, appearing wherever I spent the most time, clustering around the spaces where I felt most settled. It wasn't random. It was responsive. Whatever was creating these impressions was studying me, learning my patterns, my preferences. The day I decided to stop cleaning was the day everything changed. I left the shapes untouched, watching them for any sign of movement or transformation. They remained static, but the house filled with new sounds. Soft shuffling, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the gentle creak of weight shifting on floorboards. I started talking to them, quietly, self-consciously at first, then with growing confidence. I described my day, my thoughts, my growing sense that I wasn't alone. The shapes never responded, but the house seemed to listen. The temperature would shift slightly. The air would move differently, and I would feel acknowledged in ways I couldn't explain. The morning I woke to find a shape on my bed, pressed into the comforter beside where I had slept, was the morning I understood. The impression was warm, had weight, left a lingering scent of something familiar, yet impossible to identify. I reached out slowly, my hand hovering over the depression, and felt the slightest resistance, as if the air itself had thickened. I don't clean anymore. Not the way I used to. The shapes are everywhere now, covering every surface, overlapping and interweaving, until my home looks like a map of invisible occupancy. I've learned to step carefully, to respect the space they claim, to coexist with presence that demands nothing but acknowledgement. The dust still settles, but now it settles with purpose. Each morning I wake to find new configurations, new arrangements that speak of lives lived parallel to mine. They're not haunting me. They're not trying to frighten me. They're simply there, sharing space, marking territory, creating evidence of existence in the only way they can. I've stopped trying to understand. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced. And as I navigate my home, stepping around the shapes that multiply daily, I find myself comforted by the knowledge that I'm not alone, that whatever forces create these impressions have chosen my space as their canvas, my floor as their voice. The dust speaks now, tells stories in patterns only I can read. And in the growing collection of shapes that map my home, I find a strange peace in sharing my space with the invisible, the impossible, the persistently present. Story 7. I thought it was just a leaky faucet. That soft, rhythmic drip echoing through the pipes. But then I heard words, not loud, not spoken, just fragments, ideas I hadn't said aloud, thoughts I hadn't finished. The sink murmurs them back, not repeating, but continuing, answering. I ran the water to drown it out. The voice laughed, quietly. Now, even dry, the pipes echo with something that knows me, something that finishes what I fear to say. I haven't washed my hands in days. I'm scared of what it might suggest next. The ceramic felt cold against my palm when I first leaned in to listen. A mistake, perhaps. The metal faucet carried a subtle warmth, as if someone had been touching it moments before. The drain exhaled that musty scent of old water and forgotten soap, mixed with something else. Something medicinal, sharp, like the inside of a pharmacy bottle, left open too long. I pressed my ear closer to the edge of the basin. The whispers weren't coming from the drain itself, but from somewhere deeper, from the walls where the pipes disappear into darkness. The voice spoke in my own cadence, my own rhythm, but with knowledge I didn't possess. It knew about the letter I'd been writing, but never sent. It knew about the conversation I'd rehearsed but never had. It completed sentences I'd started only in my mind. You were going to tell her. It murmured through the copper arteries behind the wall. About the thing you saw in the mirror last week. I hadn't told anyone about that. Hadn't even fully admitted it to myself. The reflection that moved a second too late. The smile that lingered when mine had already faded. I'd convinced myself it was fatigue, stress, the fluorescent light playing tricks. But the sink knew better. The sink remembered what I'd forgotten. I started keeping a notebook beside the basin. Each whisper, each fragment of conversation that shouldn't exist, I wrote down in careful script. The pages filled quickly. The voice grew bolder, more conversational. It began asking questions about my day, my dreams, my fears. Questions I found myself answering aloud, as if speaking to an old friend who lived in the walls. The water turned lukewarm when I ran it, no matter how I adjusted the handles. Not hot, not cold, but that uncomfortable temperature of human touch. I noticed my reflection in the chrome faucet looked different, sharper somehow, more defined than it should be in such a curved surface. My eyes appeared larger, my mouth smaller, as if the metal was correcting some flaw I'd never noticed. I tried recording the whispers with my phone, holding it close to the pipes where the voice seemed strongest. The playback revealed only static and the distant hum of electricity. But while recording, I could hear it clearly, discussing my childhood pet, a detail I'd never shared with anyone, describing the recurring dream about the locked door in my basement, naming the coworker I'd been avoiding since the incident with the broken printer. The smell grew stronger over the following days. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent. Like antiseptic mixed with old roses, or the way a hospital room smells after someone important has left. I found myself breathing it in deeply, craving that strange comfort it provided. The scent clung to my clothes, followed me to other rooms, but disappeared entirely when I stepped outside. One evening, I noticed the pipes had begun to vibrate. Not shaking, not rattling, but pulsing with a rhythm that felt familiar. Like a heartbeat, but slower, more deliberate. When I placed my hand against the wall, I could feel it traveling through the structure of the building. The vibration seemed to respond to my touch, growing stronger when I pressed harder, fading when I pulled away. The voice started finishing my sentences before I could speak them. I'd approach the sink with a question, and it would provide the answer before I'd opened my mouth. It knew I was going to ask about the photograph I'd found in my coat pocket, the one of a room I'd never seen, with furniture that looked exactly like mine, but arranged differently. It knew I was going to ask about the messages I'd been receiving from numbers that didn't exist. I tried shutting off the water supply to the entire building. The maintenance panel in the basement was covered in dust and cobwebs, but the valves turned easily, as if they'd been used recently. The pipes groaned and settled as the water stopped flowing. But the whispers continued, unchanged, uninterrupted. If anything, they became clearer, more articulate, as if the absence of water had removed some interference. The notebook filled with conversations I didn't remember having. Pages of handwriting that looked like mine, but felt foreign, describing events that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The voice had opinions about my choices, suggestions for improvements, ideas for projects I'd never considered. It knew about the promotion I'd applied for in secret, the medical appointment I'd been postponing, the book I'd been reading but never finished. I started leaving questions written on slips of paper beside the sink. The answers came as whispers, which I transcribed faithfully. The voice seemed pleased with this arrangement, more willing to elaborate, to share details it had previously kept to itself. It told me about the previous tenant, about the things she'd whispered to the pipes during her final weeks, about the maintenance worker who'd installed the faucet, and the strange requests he'd made about the water pressure. The reflection in the chrome grew more distinct, more independent. I caught it moving when I wasn't, turning its head to look at things I couldn't see. The eyes in the reflection seemed to focus on points beyond the mirror, as if watching something behind me. When I turned to look, I found nothing but the familiar bathroom wall, but the reflection never seemed surprised by my inability to see what it was watching. The temperature in the room began to fluctuate, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The tiles felt warm under my feet near the sink, cooler by the door. The air itself seemed to have texture, thick near the pipes, thin by the window. I found myself spending more time in the bathroom, drawn to the comfortable warmth that radiated from the plumbing. The voice began describing my future, not predictions, but plans. It spoke of changes I would make, people I would meet, decisions I would reconsider. It knew about the letter I was going to write, the conversation I was going to have, the appointment I was going to cancel. Its knowledge felt less like prophecy and more like instruction, as if it was gently guiding me toward inevitable conclusions. I realized I'd stopped using the sink for washing. The thought of running water over my hands, of disturbing the delicate ecosystem, of whispers and warmth, seemed somehow inappropriate. I used the kitchen faucet instead, though the water there felt harsh and chemical compared to the gentle temperature I'd grown accustomed to. The notebook became my primary form of communication with the voice. I'd write questions, and it would whisper answers that I'd transcribe immediately. The conversations grew longer, more philosophical. It had opinions about my relationships, my career, my deepest fears. It knew about the thing I'd buried in the backyard as a child, the lie I'd told my parents about the broken window, the dream I'd had about drowning in a bathtub filled with mirrors. On the final night, I found myself standing before the sink in complete darkness. The voice was clearer than ever, no longer whispering, but speaking in normal tones. It was discussing the choice I was about to make, the decision that had been building for weeks. It knew about the phone call I was going to make, the confession I was going to offer, the truth I was finally going to tell. I reached for the handles, ready to turn on the water for the first time in days. The metal felt warm, alive, pulsing with that familiar rhythm. The voice grew quiet, expectant, as if waiting for something important to happen. I turned the handle slowly, and the water began to flow. But it wasn't water. It was something else entirely. Something that moved with purpose, that had weight and intention. Something that knew exactly where it was going and why. I watched it spiral down the drain, carrying with it all the secrets I'd whispered, all the questions I'd asked, all the answers I'd received. The voice was silent now. The pipes no longer vibrated. The reflection in the chrome showed only what it should, my face, tired and confused, staring at an ordinary faucet in an ordinary bathroom. But the notebook remained, filled with conversations I couldn't remember having, answers to questions I'd never asked, and instructions for a future I was no longer sure I wanted to follow. The sink looks normal now. Clean, functional, silent. But sometimes, when the building settles or the wind changes direction, I hear something familiar echoing through the walls. Not words exactly, but the shape of words, the memory of conversation, the promise of answers to questions I haven't learned to ask yet. I still avoid using that sink. Some truths are better left unspoken. Some conversations are better left unfinished. And some whispers are better left unheard, even when they know exactly what you're thinking before you think it. Story 8. The lighting's normal. No tricks, no double sources. But there's a patch just near the closet where a shadow appears that doesn't belong. It's shaped like me, almost, but the arms hang too long. The stance is too still. It moves when I don't and freezes when I turn to look. I tried recording it. The footage went black. I measured angles, tested bulbs. The shadow remains. It's not attached to anything. It's waiting for something. And when I stand in the right spot, I feel it lean closer, like it wants to fit inside my own. The room smells different when the shadow is most active. A metallic scent, like copper pennies left in rain. The air feels thicker, more resistant to movement. My fingers trace the wall where the shadow ends, and the surface vibrates with the faintest tremor. So subtle I question whether I'm imagining it. I've started keeping a journal. Pages filled with measurements, sketches of the shadow's position throughout different periods. The entries reveal patterns I hadn't noticed before. The shadow grows longer during certain atmospheric conditions. When storms approach, it stretches toward the window. When the air is still, it contracts into a tight, human-like silhouette. The most disturbing discovery came when I placed a lamp directly where the shadow falls. The light should have eliminated it entirely. Instead, the shadow absorbed the illumination, becoming darker, more defined. The lamp's bulb flickered once, then died completely. The replacement bulb lasted only minutes before suffering the same fate. I began leaving recording devices around the room. Audio recorders, cameras, even my phone positioned at different angles. Each device malfunctioned in its own way. The audio recordings captured whispers that sounded like my own voice, but speaking words I never said. The cameras showed static patterns that resembled reaching hands. My phone's screen cracked in a perfect outline of a human profile. Sleep became impossible, not because of fear, but because the shadow's presence demanded attention. I could feel it watching, studying, learning. When I closed my eyes, I sensed its movement, shifting, adjusting, refining its mimicry of my form. The sensation was like being measured for clothing by invisible hands. I tried different positions around the room, testing the shadow's reactions. When I stood near the window, it leaned toward the door. When I moved to the center of the room, it retreated to the corner. But when I positioned myself directly opposite the shadow's location, something extraordinary happened. The shadow stepped forward, matching my movement exactly. For a moment, we were synchronized, two figures moving in perfect, impossible harmony. The temperature in that spot dropped noticeably. My breath became visible, even though the rest of the room remained warm. The shadow's edges sharpened, becoming more solid, more real. I could see details that shouldn't exist: the texture of fabric, the curve of fingers, the subtle rise and fall of breathing. I reached out my hand. The shadow reached back. Our fingers almost touched across the space between us, and I felt a pull, not physical, but something deeper, like recognition, like coming home to a place I'd never been. The shadow's face, though featureless, seemed to study mine with familiar intensity. The contact lasted only seconds before I jerked my hand away. But the damage was done. The shadow had learned something new. It began appearing in other locations, not just near the closet, but by the bed, near the bathroom door, sometimes multiple shadows in different corners of the room. I started finding evidence of its presence when I wasn't looking. Handprints on surfaces I hadn't touched. Impressions in the carpet where no one had walked. The mirror reflected movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, only my own reflection stared back. The worst part was the growing realization that the shadow wasn't just copying me, it was replacing me. Gradually, imperceptibly, but consistently. My reflection looked slightly different. My shadow in sunlight fell at angles that didn't match my position. People began responding to me as if I'd said things I hadn't, done things I didn't remember. I tried to eliminate the shadow by changing everything. Rearranged the furniture, replaced the lighting, even painted the walls a different color. But the shadow adapted to each change, finding new ways to manifest. It was no longer bound to that single spot near the closet. It had learned to exist anywhere I could cast a shadow. The journal entries became more frantic, less coherent. My handwriting changed subtly from page to page, as if different versions of myself were taking turns writing. Some entries described events I didn't remember experiencing. Others contained observations about my own behavior written in my own hand, but from an outsider's perspective. I realized I was no longer fighting to eliminate the shadow. I was fighting to determine which one of us was real. The shadow moved with increasing confidence, while I felt myself becoming less substantial, less certain of my own existence. When I looked in the mirror, I had to concentrate to see my reflection. When I spoke, I had to focus to hear my own voice. The final entry in my journal was written in handwriting that was almost, but not quite, my own. It described watching me sleep, studying my expressions, learning to breathe in rhythm with my unconscious body. It detailed plans to step fully into my life, to become the primary version while I faded into the background. I woke up that morning feeling different, lighter, less connected to the physical world. The shadow was gone from its usual spot near the closet, but I could feel its presence more strongly than ever. It wasn't separate from me anymore. It was me, or I was it, or we were something new entirely. Now I cast shadows that move independently. My reflection sometimes waves when I'm not waving. People look at me with a mixture of familiarity and confusion, as if they recognize me but can't place from where. I've started keeping a new journal, but the handwriting keeps changing, and I'm no longer certain which thoughts are originally mine. The room still smells like copper pennies when the air is still. But now, I'm not sure if I'm the one noticing the smell, or if I'm the one causing it. The shadow and I have become something unified, something that exists in the spaces between light and dark, between real and imagined, between self and other. I know someone new will eventually move into this room. They'll notice the strange patch near the closet where shadows fall differently. They'll try to rationalize it, document it, eliminate it. And I'll be there, waiting, learning, becoming whatever they need me to become. The shadow that was me is gone, but the shadow that is me continues, patient and persistent, ready to teach the next person about the flexible nature of identity and the thin boundaries between observer and observed. The lighting's normal. No tricks, no double sources. But there's always a shadow where someone doesn't cast one. Story 9. Every room cools evenly except one. The guest room. I've tried everything: fans, open windows, portable units. But the air stays warm, dense, and faintly sweet, like breath left behind. I left a thermometer inside, it shattered. The bed's always rumpled, like someone just stood up. I stopped going in after I noticed the sheets never cooled. Even untouched, always warm, always waiting. It's not the heat that scares me. It's the intent. Like something in that room remembers what it means to have skin. The house came to me through inheritance, wrapped in paperwork and distant relatives I'd never met. The real estate agent spoke in practiced tones about character and charm, but her eyes avoided the guest room door. I should have asked why she kept stepping away from it, why her voice dropped when she mentioned the previous owner's sudden departure. But the price was right, and I needed somewhere to disappear. The first week felt normal enough. I arranged my books, hung my pictures, learned the house's particular sounds. Every old house has its voice, creaking floorboards, settling walls, pipes that sing in the deep of night. This one whispered differently, softer, more deliberate. The guest room door would drift open despite the latch. I'd close it, test the mechanism, even replace the hardware. But come morning, there it would be, standing ajar like an invitation. The warmth started as a comfort, while the rest of the house grew cold with the changing season. That room maintained a perfect temperature. I rationalized it as insulation, maybe pipes running through the walls. I even convinced myself it was a selling point. Guests would love the consistent climate. But no one came to stay. Friends made excuses. Family found other accommodations. The room waited, patient and heated, for visitors who never arrived. I began documenting everything. Temperature readings, photographs of the perpetually disturbed bedding, audio recordings of sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The camera captured what my eyes couldn't quite process. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Reflections in the window that showed the room as it had been, not as it was. In one photograph, the bed appeared made with military precision. In the next, taken moments later, the impression of a body curved into the mattress, as if someone had been lying there for hours. The scent grew stronger as the weather turned, sweet and warm, like skin after sleep, like breath against a pillow. I found myself standing in the doorway, breathing it in despite the way it made my chest tight. The smell followed me through the house now, clinging to my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat. I washed everything repeatedly, but the sweetness remained, a constant reminder that something in that room was very much alive. The sounds became impossible to ignore. Soft rustling, like fabric against fabric. The creak of mattress springs under shifting weight. Sometimes, if I pressed my ear to the wall, I could hear what sounded like humming, a wordless melody that made my teeth ache. I recorded hours of audio, but playback revealed only static and the occasional whisper that might have been my own voice, distorted beyond recognition. I tried to seal the room. New locks, weather stripping, even boards nailed across the door frame. But the heat seeped through, warming the hallway, spreading its influence like an infection. The boards warped overnight, expanding in the unnatural warmth until they split and fell away. The locks clicked open by themselves, mechanisms turning with deliberate precision. The room wanted to be entered, and it would not be denied. The breaking point came when I woke to find my own bed cold, while the guest room blazed with heat. I could feel it through the walls, radiating outward like a fever. I approached the door, knowing I shouldn't, but unable to resist. The handle turned easily in my grip, and I stepped inside. The room was exactly as I'd left it, yet completely transformed. The air shimmered with heat waves, and the sweet scent was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste. The bed was perfectly made, but as I watched, the covers began to move. Not the dramatic thrashing of movie ghosts, but the subtle shifting of someone settling in for sleep. The impression of a head on the pillow, shoulders beneath the sheet, the gentle rise and fall of breathing. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the blanket. It was warm, soft, and gave way under my fingers like flesh. The breathing stopped. The room held its breath, waiting. Then, slowly, the covers began to pull back, revealing nothing but the heated air and the lingering scent of something that had once been human. I ran then, stumbling through the hallway, grabbing my keys and wallet without looking back. I drove until the sun rose, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull over. But even there, miles away, I could smell that sweet warmth, feel the phantom heat against my skin. The room had marked me, claimed me in some fundamental way. I never went back to collect my things. The house stands empty now, or so I tell myself. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch that scent again, sweet and warm and patient. The guest room is still there, still heated, still waiting. And I know, with a certainty that sits cold in my chest, that it's not waiting for a guest anymore. It's waiting for me.